Hello friends, and welcome back to yet another episode of Economic Sutra. This is the second part of a two-part series that we did on India's economic journey since independence. This is a part of Sansad TV's Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav celebrations, which is also a part of the wider Bharat Ek Soch series that is being done on this channel. Now, in the last episode of this two-part series, you may remember that we covered the journey from 1947 till 1991. In this episode, we are going to go from 1991 till 2022. You will remember that in the late 80s, what happened is that there was a period of sort of fresh air under Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's rule, in the sense that new products, new ideas suddenly did begin to find themselves. But this was done without actually reforming the economy. So the old regime of licenses and permits continued to be in existence, and as a result, many of the productivity gains and efficiency gains that can happen from opening up didn't really happen. Instead, growth was being driven more and more by taking on more external debt. Now, the problem with that, of course, was India became more and more indebted, and in 1991, it faced a major crisis. Now, the context of the crisis was not just that there was a war in the Middle East and oil prices went up, but also a major political crisis in India itself. Two minority governments, that of VP Singh and then of Chandrasekhar, collapsed. And then immediately after that, there was an election in which former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated. So it was in this rather uncertain time that a minority government under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao came to power, and it had a real problem in its hands. India was facing bankruptcy and default. So, in an emergency move, overnight, India was forced to hypothecate 40-50 tons of gold to the Bank of England and to the Bank of Japan in order to gain immediate liquidity. Now, this was a humiliating moment, as you can imagine. Also humiliating was the fact that India had to go with a begging bowl to the IMF, which then put all kinds of stringent conditionalities on India as far as economic reforms was concerned. Faced with all these major economic problems, Prime Minister Rao was looking for a credible finance minister. He initially asked the well-known economist I.G. Patel if he would take over the job, but when he refused, he opted for a recently retired Reserve Bank governor, Manmohan Singh. And together, they finally began to dismantle the license permit system that had shackled India's economy for the last several decades. Many of these reforms were done over the course of several months. Foreign direct investment was finally allowed back in. The rupee was significantly depreciated, and of course some more reforms were then announced into 1992, particularly in the budget speech of 1992.
The changes I have proposed are expected to result in a net revenue loss of rupees 517 crores to the centre, while the states will gain rupees 1500 crores. Consequently, the estimated year-end budget deficit of the centre for 92-93 will be rupees 5,389 crores, and the fiscal deficit for that year will be 34,408 crores. India's development is of tremendous significance for the future of the entire developing world. To realize our development potential, we have to unshackle the human spirit of creativity, idealism, adventure and enterprise that our people possess in abundant measure. We have to harness all our latent resources for a second industrial revolution and a second agricultural revolution.
Now, it should be remembered that not everybody was in favor of these reforms. These were reforms that had been forced upon India under difficult circumstances, and the intellectual climate in India still was in favor of the old socialist system despite decades of failure. So ironically, even as these reforms were being done, they were done in a very apologetic sort of way, because the intellectuals of the time, the opposition parties, and in fact even Indian industry argued against opening up of the economy. Thus, at the end of his budget speech in 1992, Finance Minister Manmohan Singh would make a statement that goes as this.
Tonight, I feel like going to the theatre. Let the assassins be informed. I am prepared to meet their onslaughts. As the poet said, "Sarfaroshi ki tamanna ab hamare dil mein hai, dekhna hai zor kitna bazuye qaatil mein."
Now, the impact of these reforms was almost immediate, in fact surprisingly fast. It saw huge amount of new investment coming in, particularly from FDI. New banks were allowed to be set up, including in the private sector. Foreign banks opened up operations in India. Foreign brokers began to trade in Indian stocks. Large number of international consultancies set up shop, and so on and so forth. In fact, as a result of this sudden rush of investment, both private and foreign, Nariman Point suddenly saw real estate prices shooting up. In fact, all of a sudden, Nariman Point in Mumbai became one of the most expensive real estate markets in the world. Now, the impact of this series of reforms was surprisingly fast, in the sense that by 1995, you saw not only that the economy was growing, but there were all kinds of new sectors that were popping up. You will remember the automobile sector till the mid 80s had been dominated by just one or two cars, the Ambassador and the Premier Padmini. In the late 80s, it had been taken over by Maruti, but by the 90s, there were all kinds of companies and all kinds of models freely available. Here are some of the ads from that time. This is one by Hyundai, which shows you the popular car of that time called Santro, but also another one by a company called Daewoo and a car called Matiz, which was being manufactured in India for exports, an unheard of thing at that time.
They chased me. They convinced me to advertise the Hyundai Santro. Oh, कहाँ गई? Oh, बढ़िया कार है. Oh, बढ़िया slogan सोचना पड़ेगा. Whoa, whoa. What's unique about the Santro? The most powerful Epsilon engine, computerized multi-point fuel injection. Santro actually drives longer per liter. और भीड़ भाड़ में भी driving easy. अरे सीटी आपके लिए नहीं बजाई दोस्त. Slogan idea. Power ही power. क्या हुआ? अच्छा नहीं लगा? Santro also has the international tall boy design, which means more headroom, leg room, more luggage space. Slogan idea. Space ho to AC. Oh, shut up. Santro is India's first multifunctional car. Office, school, shopping, holiday, weekday car, weekend car. Shh. Weekend car. क्या बोला तुमने? Complete family car. यही तो मैं भी कहना चाह रहा था. It's the complete family car. Hyundai Santro.
At the same time that this was all happening, we also saw the opening up of entertainment and news and information, and one of the routes for this was cable news. So you saw, for example, every neighborhood across India being crisscrossed by these cables, bringing new kinds of programming to the Indian audience. And of course there was Star Plus, which was a very popular channel of that time.
This is the Star TV network, and you're watching Star Plus.
Another big sector that opened up was the airline sector. All this while, India had been by and large restricted to the public sector really, Indian Airlines and Air India, and all of a sudden there were all these new private airlines, some of whose names you may not remember, but East West, Modi Luft, Damania, and then of course Jet Airways. Here is an ad from Sahara Airlines from that period.
Can't have fried food, can't have sweets, got to watch my calories. What do I do? Can't have this.
Your special meal, sir. Your wife had called.
Special diet meals only on Sahara Airlines.
Experience a new high.
In addition to these new sectors that were sort of being introduced into India, there were also completely brand new sectors that emerged. One of them was the software sector. Now, some of these companies had already existed in the 80s, but it's really in the 90s that many of these companies and the sector more widely began to see dramatic growth, partly at least because of the Y2K phenomena of that time. So all of a sudden companies like Wipro, Infosys, etc. became household names, and first generation entrepreneurs like Nandan Nilekani, for example, also people that were people read about and heard about, unlike the more traditional family multi-generational family businessmen that we had been used to seeing up to that point. A sector that emerged out of this sort of technological change and communications revolution was the BPO sector. Now, no one had imagined up to this point that you could actually have an export sector in the services sector that was directly supporting clients internationally. So the back office operations, and more specifically the call centers, began to pop up in places like Bangalore, in Gurgaon, and so on. So companies like GE, American Express, British Airways set up these huge factory-like offices where young men and women would basically return calls from all over the world. And this was quite a major phenomena in the sense that there was a whole subculture around it. Popular books were written about it as well, and you saw an entire ecosystem of training that developed, including training for foreign accents. The 1990s had been actually quite a surprising period. After having seen a major shock in the right at the beginning, a crisis, it was followed by big reforms and an economy that recovered actually quite quickly. So there was a period in the mid-90s where the Indian economy was growing quite strongly. There were all kinds of new sectors being opened up and evolving, as we have just seen. But it was also a time where the lacuna of the Indian policy framework got shored up. Remember, whole new markets were being opened, but the regulatory framework for those markets did not yet exist. So right in the beginning, you saw a financial scandal, the infamous Harshad Mehta scandal. And as a result of these scandals, the government was forced to create a new regulatory framework. So you saw regulators such as SEBI, for example, which already existed, but it's only in 1992 that it was given real teeth. You saw the establishment of the TRAI for regulating telecoms. You saw the establishment of the Competition Commission, regulators for insurance, for pensions, and so on and so forth. So the entire regulatory framework was also built during the 1990s. By the late 90s, however, new problems began to emerge. The first shock came in the form of the Asian crisis of 1997-98. Now, India was not directly a part of that crisis, but it certainly impacted us because of the impact on the wider emerging market landscape. Then we also had a period of political instability. Repeatedly, governments rose and fell, minority governments that simply were not able to keep their governments going. And in the middle of that, of course, Prime Minister Vajpayee decided to attempt the nuclear tests in 1998. Here is a clip of him announcing these tests.
Today, at 15:45 hours, India conducted 3 underground nuclear tests in the Pokhran range. These tests conducted today were with a fission device, a low-yield device, and a thermonuclear device.
Prime Minister Vajpayee came back to power with a better majority in 1999, but then he was faced with yet another problem, the 1999 Kargil War. So clearly it was obvious that although economic performance had improved with liberalization, more needed to be done. And it was under Prime Minister Vajpayee that a whole new gamut of reforms was attempted. In particular, it was under him that India began to aspire to things world class, in particular world class infrastructure for the very first time. So a big program was launched of creating the Golden Quadrilateral network of highways. We began to aspire to creating metro systems in Indian cities. We began to create new airports, and very importantly, the expansion of the mobile telephony network and the internet network across India, which would have huge impact over the next several decades, because all of a sudden a country where it required doing all kinds of sifarish in order to get a fixed line, everybody suddenly had a mobile telephone, and this had dramatic impact on how India functioned. Here is an advertisement from the early 2000s of a popular advertisement of a mobile telephone company.
दिल्ली में सरकार बनानी चाहिए, हाँ या ना? पार्टी हमसे पूछ रही है, पार्टी हमसे पूछ रही है। हाँ, ना, यस,
ना, वेरी गुड, मैंने भी हाँ भेजा।
हाँ, ना, हाँ, हाँ।
आप जनता की सुनेंगे तो जनता आपकी सुनेगी, इसी को कहते डेमोक्रेसी। व्हाट एन आइडिया सर जी, जय हो।
The economy recovered into the early 2000s, inflation came off, and clearly all these reforms were beginning to pay off. Nonetheless, Prime Minister Vajpayee lost the election of 2004, and we saw not just the Congress party return, but interestingly, former Finance Minister Manmohan Singh returned as Prime Minister.
In the name of God, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of India, that I will faithful and conscientiously discharge my duties as Prime Minister.
In some ways, this allowed for a continuity of policies, all driven towards a market-oriented, liberalized economy, and the continuity showed through in multiple ways, in the sense that broadly speaking, we continued with pro-market policies. We continued to build out some of the infrastructure that had been started out during the Vajpayee era, and we saw much of that infrastructure actually find fruition during the Manmohan Singh years. For example, the opening up of brand new top quality airports in places like Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, and so on. The confidence that came from building out new infrastructure, opening out new sectors, showed through also in growth. The 2000s were a period of relative prosperity, in the sense that the global environment was conducive, India was generating high GDP growth rates, and inflation was reasonably benign. Whole new sector began to emerge even in this decade, and in areas again that had not been predicted. For example, the sports sector. Who would have thought that India, notoriously known for being poor at virtually every sport, suddenly became home to one of the world's largest sport pools, the IPL, the Indian Premier League, which very, very quickly became the biggest cricket league in the world, and in terms of the sheer amount of money behind it, was competing with, the football or baseball or basketball leagues around the world in terms of sheer scale. Unfortunately, this run of growth through the 2000s did not last. Yet again, an international shock was precursor of more difficult times in the form of the global financial crisis of 2007-8. India was again not directly a part of the crisis because much of this happened in the North Atlantic, but it certainly had sent shockwaves through the Indian economy as well. India was also hit by a series of corruption scandals. There were all kinds of insinuations about the auctioning of 2G spectrum, of coal blocks, and so on. And so that again significantly impacted the mood. Also, another thing that impacted the mood was bank lending, because as part of the recovery from the global financial crisis, the banks had opened up the gates and had gone out and overlent, and in many cases misallocated capital. And as a result of which, by the year 2012-2013, many of these loans began to go wrong. So suddenly, despite having had a period of rapid growth over the previous decade, India found itself in 2013 as being considered a part of the Fragile Five. In 2014, the government again changed, and Gujarat Chief Minister Narendra Modi was sworn in as India's Prime Minister.
मैं नरेंद्र दामोदर दास मोदी ईश्वर की शपथ लेता हूं कि मैं विधि द्वारा स्थापित भारत के संविधान के प्रति सच्ची श्रद्धा और निष्ठा रखूंगा। मैं भारत की प्रभुता और अखंडता का अक्षुण्ण रखूंगा। मैं संघ के प्रधानमंत्री के रूप में अपने कर्तव्यों का श्रद्धापूर्वक और शुद्ध अंतःकरण से निर्वहन करूंगा।
He faced a situation where the banking system was clearly under stress and growth was again beginning to slow down. Now, do remember that by this point, India had already gone through about 2 decades of reforms. These reforms had meant that growth performance had been significantly better than had been under the socialist period. However, there was still a problem. Clearly, inflation kept spiking up from time to time, and there were these breakdowns that would happen, particularly on the banking side, and there would be these frequent scandals. And of course, India's internal market still remained divided up into small pockets because of internal tariffs that were not coordinated. So the task of the new Prime Minister was to tackle these problems. In other words, to create a framework in which this new economy based on entrepreneurship, risk-taking, innovation could play itself out. And this is precisely what he began to do. So over the next several years, a large number of framework reforms were introduced. They included, for example, the Aadhaar unique ID number for every Indian. In 2015, we saw the introduction of an inflation targeting framework to be run by the Monetary Policy Committee. In 2016, an insolvency and bankruptcy code was introduced in order to create the framework for continuous creative destruction in the corporate sector. In 2017, we saw the introduction of GST in order to unify and synchronize all the internal indirect taxes across the country, and in that way finally create a unified common market inside the country. This was launched at a midnight event on the 1st of July in 2017.
गरीबों का उद्धार, तेज विकास, जीएसटी से। GST, Good and Simple Tax.
So even as the Indian government was putting in place the framework reforms for allowing a economy driven by entrepreneurship, risk-taking, innovation and so on, it was also at the very same time putting in place interventions to help the very poorest in the economy and provide them with a safety net. Now notice here that this is an effort to directly target absolute poverty. Large number of schemes in this direction were put in place. For example, the Jan Dhan Yojana, basically providing financial inclusion. The Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, where toilets were built for the poor, and similarly you had the Ujjwala scheme where cooking gas was provided to the very poor. Then of course Nal Se Jal, by which piped water was provided to the rural households. So you can see that at every step direct efforts were made to provide support.
ये धुआं, ये मेहनत, ये परेशानियां, महिलाओं को मिले सम्मान, इसलिए हम लाए हैं प्रधानमंत्री उज्ज्वला योजना। हर रसोई में हो एलपीजी, जिससे मिले समय और पैसों की बचत और बेहतर स्वास्थ्य और सम्मान भी। प्रधानमंत्री उज्ज्वला योजना का राष्ट्र को लोकार्पण होगा 1 मई 2016 को बलिया, उत्तर प्रदेश से। स्वच्छ ईंधन, बेहतर जीवन।
Now at the end of 2019, it would have seemed that we were in a position where many of these big framework reforms had been finally implemented reasonably satisfactorily. Many of these safety net measures had also been put in place, and that the road was clear in front. But that was not to be. In the beginning of 2020, India and the wider world was hit by a big new shock, the COVID-19 pandemic. And with the situation rapidly uncertain, Prime Minister Modi was forced to announce a full lockdown for the country in March 2020.
आज रात 12 बजे से संपूर्ण देश में संपूर्ण लॉकडाउन होने जा रहा है। हिंदुस्तान को बचाने के लिए, हिंदुस्तान के हर नागरिक को बचाने के लिए, आपको बचाने के लिए, आपके परिवार को बचाने के लिए आज रात 12 बजे से घरों से बाहर निकलने पर पूरी तरह पाबंदी लगाई जा रही है।
As you can imagine, the COVID period was a difficult period. There was a great deal of uncertainty about how this pandemic was going to pan itself out. The lockdown was economically very expensive, as you can imagine, and a lot of support had to be provided to the economy. Again, a very targeted effort was put in. For example, the world's largest food program was announced, with food being made available for 800 million people, so that there was some sort of a safety net created for the very poor. At the same time, large amounts of financial liquidity was pumped into the system for the business sector. But an important aspect of the Indian approach was, despite these shocks, the government did not lose track of the need for doing supply side measures. So continuously through this phase, supply side measures also continued to be announced. Often many experts of that time were surprised that India was doing this. But our view throughout this was the following, that in the end, demand management was not going to solve the problem. What we needed was to prepare for a post-COVID world where India would be more competitive in the new world, whatever that would be. So a large number of reforms were also announced during this period, whether it was the liberalization of the drone sector or the opening up of the cartography sector, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, on the health front, India rolled out the world's largest vaccination program.
हम देशवासियों ने, हमारे वैज्ञानिकों ने, हमारे उद्यमियों की ताकत का ही ये परिणाम है कि भारत को वैक्सीन के लिए किसी और देश पर हमें निर्भर नहीं होना।
Again, there were many naysayers. Nobody would have believed that India was not only going to produce vaccines for hundreds of millions of people, but that it was going to be able to successfully administer them. But through the course of 2021 and into 2022, India proved to the world that it had both the industrial and the administrative capacity of being able to do this. A very impressive thing indeed. So coming into 2022, again the world began to open up. India's economy too accelerated. But as I mentioned, India had maintained a razor focus on continuing to do supply side measures throughout this phase. And so we saw during this period, for example, Air India being privatized again. And in fact, it went back to being part of the Tata Group's stable, the place from which it had come in originally anyway. Also, we saw the listing of LIC. Remember the Mundra scandal of 1955-56? So in some ways, here in 2022, we have come full circle. Our economic journey from the late 40s and early 50s till today has been a journey that has been full of ups and downs. Many experiments were done. Some did not succeed, some succeeded. But on the whole, we have now emerged at the end of this 75-year period with an economy that can genuinely claim to be an emerging power. In 2022 and expected into 2023, it is the world's fastest growing major economy. Not trivial things for a country that was for a long time seen as being a perpetual economic laggard. Now, let's look forward into the next 25 years. What are the kinds of reforms that we should expect into the next 25 years? So here we are in 2022 celebrating 75 years of being an independent country. And it has been quite a journey. It has been a journey with ups and downs, with experiments that went right and experiments that went wrong. But I think it's fair to say that we find ourselves today in a position where we can claim to be the world's fastest growing major economy. And this is no trivial thing for a country that had been seen for many, many years as being a perpetual economic laggard. But as we look into the next 25 years, what can we expect? Well, we certainly aspire to be a global economic power, but that will require that we continue to work, we continue to push and improve ourselves over the next quarter of a century. So what are the reforms we need to do over the next quarter of a century? To understand that, let's look back over the last 25-30 years. When we talked about the last 25-30 years and we said reforms, we essentially meant liberalization. In other words, the withdrawal of the Indian state from things it should not be doing. Now, of course, a lot of that has already happened. Some more maybe needs to be done, but by and large I would argue that phase of reforms is done and dusted, except for what is now left over. The next 25 years really is about getting the Indian state to do the things it should be doing. Now again, some work in that direction has already started. One of the things the Indian state needs to do is obviously provide physical infrastructure, and since the Vajpayee years at least, more and more efforts are being made to roll out world-class infrastructure across India, and that is also happening. However, I would argue there are two areas where the Indian state does need to up its game. The first area where the Indian state needs to do better is in terms of delivery of justice and enforcement of contracts. This means that one of the biggest areas that I would advocate for reform is the legal system. Now, this is not something that only the government can do. It has to do this in partnership with the judiciary, but it is certainly the case that with 40 million odd cases stuck in the legal system, we can't really make economic or other forms of human progress unless we solve this particular problem. So I would argue number one in the list, getting our legal system going, is the single biggest reform that India should aspire for in the next few years. The second big reform that India needs to do is administrative reforms. Here again, the problem is the following. We have a bureaucracy that can from time to time deliver. After all, it's the same bureaucracy that delivered the vaccination program, or every 12 years delivers on the Kumbh Mela in Prayagraj. So it is not a bureaucracy that is not capable of delivering. Unfortunately, the architecture of that bureaucracy has been set up in such a way that it is mostly designed to impose control. Now, this was what the bureaucracy was designed to do, so one shouldn't complain. It was designed under the colonial period to impose control, and in the socialist period again, the administration was basically meant to impose control. In the last 25 years, progress has been made not by improving the bureaucracy's ability to deliver services, but by withdrawing its powers so that the private sector could play itself out better. But the ability of this machinery to deliver services was still not improved. I think this is an area where we need to make progress. The Indian bureaucracy needs now to be reoriented in such a way that it thinks of itself as a service provider. There could be many services it provides. It could be municipal services, it could be policing services, many other kinds of services that the Indian state and government need to provide, and that requires thinking through administrative reforms from first principles and carrying out these reforms. So with that, let me say that I've come to the end of the second episode of this two-part series on India's journey since 1947 in the economic sphere. I hope you've enjoyed this show. I hope that the various news clippings, advertisements, etc. provide you some flavor of how that journey panned itself out. Many of you were part of that journey, so I hope you recognized some of those moments from your memory. So with that, let me say that it was lovely having you on this journey, and look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Economic Sutra right here at Sansad TV.